Mishnah 14. So it's Pirkei Avos, Mishnah Yud Dalet, chapter 4, Mishnah 14. Everything that happens is absolutely bashert. Everything is hashgacha pratis. And the fact that we're learning this Mishnah a few days before Purim is amazing, as we shall discover, time permitting. So before we start the Mishnah, we have to meet the person who's the author of the Mishnah. Rabbi Nehorai. Rabbi Nehorai. Have you ever heard that name before? Rabbi Nehorai. No? So there's a whole slew of opinions as to who Rabbi Nehorai was. Nehorai is an Aramaic word, and it means light. For which reason, quite a number of people say Rabbi Nehorai is another name for Rabbi Meir. It means the same thing. Somebody who illuminates, somebody who sheds light. Another view is that it's Rabbi Yehuda. Another view is that it's Rabbi Nehemiah. And for the purposes of our conversation, today we're going to go with the view that Rabbi Nehorai was Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, who was one of the 5 great students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was one of the greatest sages who ever lived. And in fact, that's why they say he was called Rabbi Nehorai, because he illuminated people with his teachings to such an extent that Eliyahu Hanavi personally would come to his shiur. Okay, now that's when you know that you're at a level. When Elijah rocks up at your shiur, that's a big deal. Now, why is it significant for our conversation that Rabbi Nehorai, according to some opinions, is Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? Because of a story that happened in his life, which relates directly to the theme of this particular Mishnah. Here's the story. The Gemara tells us that there was a part of the world which was known for all of its wonderful luxuries, somewhere in the region of where the Jews lived at that time, so somewhere on the borders of Israel, somewhere. There was this place that was considered the lap of luxury. So if you wanted to live the good life physically, that's where you went. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch was this incredible Torah scholar, and he decided he wanted to go there for a period of time. It's not clear why he went. And he spent a period of time there. And when he came back at the time of Parashas HaChodesh, which is the special reading that we do just before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, in those days, and the Sephardi community still does it today, when you get called up to the Torah, the person who's called up to the Torah is meant to read the portion. The whole idea of a Bal Koireh, that there's one person who reads the whole parasha, that's because people were not capable of reading it themselves. But ideally, when you're called up to the Torah, you're supposed to read it yourself. So he's called up to the Torah, and the opening line of Parashas HaChodesh is HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem. Okay? HaChodesh, first word, Hazeh Lochem. Okay? He gets up to, now we're talking about Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, we're not talking about some shlepa over here, one of the greatest scholars of the time, and by extension the whole of Jewish history. He gets up and he reads it as if it was written, instead of the Dalet, a Reish, instead of the Zayin, a Yud, and instead of a Chaf, a Beis. So he read it as Hacheresh Haya Libam, which means that their hearts had become mute. You can imagine the consternation in the shul. Somebody gets up, a person of that caliber reads with that kind of mistake. And it became a big deal, and Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch realized that this was a message. Hashem had sent him a message. Being in this environment that was so materialistic had dulled the sensitivity of his own heart. And that's what Hashem was showing him over here, by making him slip up over these words. And of course, he never went back there, and he stayed where he was. As a result, this Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, or as he's called in this Mishnah, Rabbi Nehorai, teaches us about the importance of being in the right environment, particularly when you want to learn Torah. So he's going to tell us 4 things. Number 1, Hevei goyle limkoim Torah. You should exile yourself to a place of Torah. Some of the commentaries say he's talking over here to a person who's about to begin the yeshiva studies. So don't go to the local yeshiva. Hevei goyle limkoim Torah. Go to a distant yeshiva. Oy vey, the trouble that has caused us financially over the course of history. You know how much easier it is to go to a local yeshiva. Now you've got to go overseas and pay tuition in foreign currency. Now the key word over here is goyle. Anybody know another context where we use this word, goyle? Goyle? Not the goylem. Goyle? That would be gila or legalois. But goyle, the word goyle is the word golus. So a goyle, somebody who goes into exile, is a term that we use specifically about what's called maken nefesh bishgoga, which means that if a person inadvertently killed somebody, God forbid, they would then be goyle. They would go to a different place. They'd have to go to the cities of refuge, the miklat. So they were goyle. They had to move away from home and go into a foreign environment and somewhat of an uncomfortable environment. So there's a very interesting correlation over here that we're making between going to learn Torah, that you've got to go, so to speak, out of your comfort zone. That's how we could read it. And we've got to examine the similarity to this idea that if a person kills by accident, that they've also got to be goyle. It's no accident that we have the same words. So there must be a correlation. That's his first message. Go out to a place to learn Torah. And therefore, he tells us in the next piece, Ba'al toimer, and don't think shetovoy acharecha. Don't think the Torah is going to chase you. Don't think that if you stay put, the right people will come your way and they will teach you Torah. Don't think that that's how it's going to work. You have to be willing to go out and to invest that effort and to create that sort of discomfort for yourself. Now, the third part of this Mishnah is ambiguous. Depending on which commentaries you go with, will determine how you're supposed to read the next line. So what's he told us so far? You've got to go out of your space in order to learn Torah. And he's told us, don't say it's going to chase you. Then he says, your friends will establish your Torah in your hand. Now, what's ambiguous about this? So let's read this two ways. Is he reading it? Is he telling us, go to a place of Torah that is away from home because your friends in that environment will help you establish your Torah knowledge? Or is he saying, go away from home in order to learn Torah and don't think the Torah will come to you because your friends will help you learn? So that's the ambiguity of him. We'll explore the different commentators that see two different ways that we could learn this. And then he concludes by telling us...
No, you mean the second one is that don't rely on your friends?
Correct. Okay. So don't think that you could rely on your friends, therefore you don't have to go anywhere. And the fourth point of this Mishnah is Ve'el binoscha al tisha'ein. And don't depend on your own understanding. Okay, so let's just talk about that for 1 second. The word tisha'ein. Tisha'ein. Is that a familiar word? Have you ever come across it before in any other form? Any other? To lean. Right? A mishenes is a crutch. So ve'el binoscha al tisha'ein. He doesn't say don't rely on your understanding. He says don't lean on your understanding, which is interesting. We've got to understand why he puts it in that particular way. Now here's a test that in all likelihood we shouldn't expect any of us to pass. Does anybody know where this phrase ve'el binoscha al tisha'ein originates? Because I'll give you a clue. It's not Rabbi Nohoroi's own words. Any idea where it originates? Ve'el binoscha al tisha'ein. Let's think creatively. Who would have said something like this? A lesson like don't trust your own or don't lean on your own understanding. Who do you expect to hear that kind of wisdom from?
You just said something about Purim, right?
Not yet. Not yet the Purim part. Moshe Rabbeinu. So where, if it was Moshe Rabbeinu, where would you find it? You'd expect to find it in the Chumash, right? So let's scour the Chumash. No, it's not there. Okay, let's try next. Who else would we expect to give us these kind of life insights? This kind of wisdom for life? Shlomo HaMelech, right? Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. That's what Mishlei is all about, is wisdom for life. That's where this is from. Ve'el binoscha al tisha'ein is a quotation from Mishlei. So now we've got to ask ourselves the question, so why is Rabbi Nehoroi telling us something we should have already learned previously? Okay, the reality is we don't necessarily learn everything chronologically, right? We don't finish the whole Tanakh before we learn Pirkei Avos. But in those days, there was an expectation that people knew these verses. They knew these psukim. So Why is he repeating something that we already know? And the logic of this Mishnah doesn't necessarily seem to flow. Surely the Mishnah should have been, start off first by saying, El binoscha al tishain. Let's start that way. Don't rely on your understanding. Therefore, have a goylel in koin Torah. Therefore, you should go elsewhere in order to learn Torah. Because what's the motivation for a person to stay put? A person will say, I'm good. Right? I'm good. Everything's fine. I have what I need. Or perhaps a person will say, I am capable of studying Torah on my own. Why do I have to go to yeshiva? By the way, this is a real issue that people grapple with on a regular basis. People feel, why do I have to go to the shiur? Why do I have to go to a yeshiva? I'm a smart person. I know throughout school they kept telling me that I was a top class student, so I'm obviously very intelligent. I could sit down with the books and I could learn it on my own. That's actually what Rabbi Nohiroi is addressing here. Because in the previous Mishnah we learned that there are various crowns. And we learned that of the 3 crowns that a person can access on their own, the highest is Keser Torah, the crown of Torah. So straight away now Rabbi Nohiroi says, so how do you get that crown? What do you think, you're going to sit at home and just download shiurim off YouTube and that's going to get you the crown? No. Heve goyle. The principle of Torah is that it requires some element of discomfort, some element of stepping out of yourself, going away from what is familiar. Now, let's think about this for a second. What's the benefit of going to a yeshiva or a seminary? What's the benefit of going away to study? Let's think about it. What do you stand to gain?
Being out of your environment.
So you break out of your environment, right? And why is that healthy?
It gives you the ability to change because there's not predictive.
Correct. So there's one thing, right? When you arrive in a new environment, they don't know your history. You have the opportunity for a clean slate. So that may not only be for studying, maybe at every point in our lives, every few months or every few years or whatever, we should pick up and go live somewhere else where they don't know who we are. Of course, if you have Facebook, you can forget about nobody knowing who you are, but, right?
Also discipline, like self-discipline.
Self-discipline. Where do you see the discipline in going elsewhere?
In your own environment, it's very easy to get distracted.
Exactly. Your own environment is conducive to distraction and to mediocrity. That's the reality. If a person is in their own environment, that is conducive to mediocrity. Why? Because nobody's going to push you. Nobody's going to insist that you meet a certain standard because you're in your space. Okay? Good.
What about the value of what you've researched?
So let's ask that question. Where do you find chevrusa? Where you are or where you're going to go? Okay, where you're going to go. So that's part of the ambiguity in that third element about Chaveirecha yekaimu biyodecha. One set of the commentators all say that it means when you go somewhere else and you create an environment, you create that chavruta, you create that connection to other people, that will consolidate your Torah learning. And the other set of commentaries, which is the minority of commentaries, say that in fact it's a warning. Don't think because you have chavruta where you are, because you have people around you, and because here's another layer to it, because they've been to yeshiva and they've had that exposure, maybe they will give you what you need. Don't rely on that. So it's an interesting balance over here, that part of the problem of staying put is that we have our social circle that we believe will provide for us everything that we need. But we haven't yet hit the key reason why a person should go far in order to study. What is the main thing we look for in Torah learning when we want to study? What's the main thing we look for? Exactly.
And they don't know us. So they
Exactly.
don't have any good to do.
Exactly. So what's the main reason to go far in order to study? To find somebody who would be our Rebbe, somebody who would be our Rav, somebody who would be our primary teacher of Torah. And that person, number one, you can't expect that you always have that person in your backyard. Maybe sometimes you're fortunate enough that you do. But also, you need that person to look at you with fresh eyes. You need that person who could see you without knowing, I remember you when. Right? That's one of the most undermining things for a person's development. I remember you when. It's like the story. It's not such a nice story, but there's a story that they tell about a dog. And this dog decided at some point that he didn't want to be a dog anymore. And so he went and he left the community of dogs. And he went snooping around, and he found that there was a lion that had died in natural circumstances. And all the scavengers had come and they'd eaten everything from the lion and left the skin. So this dog put the lion's skin over himself, and he started to walk around pretending to be a lion. And wherever he went, all the animals were very respectful of the fact that, he was a lion, whatever. And after some years of living the high life, he decided to go back and visit his community. Now, you'll excuse me, but you know how dogs greet each other. Yes? So he arrives over there with this lion outfit, and all the dogs come sniffing. And he says, "Hey, I'm a lion." Well, that's not how you treat a lion. And they say, "We know who you are. We remember you when you were still a dog." So that's the thing. Sometimes the environment we live in, they remember us when we still were immature or not so committed, or whatever the particular case is. When you go far, it creates opportunity for somebody who could become a guide and a mentor without the baggage of what was there before. Okay. So that would appear to be what it's telling us over here. Right? That would appear to be the main message over here. Now the thing is this. When Shlomo HaMelech says, "Ve'el binascha al tisha'in," don't rely on or don't lean on your own understanding. He's not saying you shouldn't use your own understanding. He's saying you shouldn't lean on it. That means to say it shouldn't be the entire basis of a person's connection to their Torah. Why? Because at the end of the day, Torah is not intellectual. Now this is a very important principle. Torah is not intellectual. Science, lahavdil, is intellectual. That means that the principles of science are principles that any person who is intelligent through examination of the world should be able to arrive at these empirical ideas. Because it's pure intellect and it can be proven. So even if you never have a science professor in your life, it is possible, if you're smart enough, that you could work out the scientific principles of thermodynamics or gravity or whatever it might be. The same would go for philosophy. It's intellectual. If you're an intellectual person, you might be able to create your own philosophy. You could become a leader in the field. You could become a guru. It is quite possible because these are intellectual processes. In any intellectual process, you can rely on your understanding and you'll probably get to where you need to. So what's Torah? Torah is not intellectual. So what is Torah? Does it have an intellectual component? Yes. Is that a significant part of Torah? Yes. But is that Torah? No. Why not? It's Masorah, right? That was the first Mishnah we learned in Pirkei Avos, right? That it's a Masorah, it's a tradition that is passed down through the generations. That still doesn't tell me what it is. That tells me the process of how we're supposed to accept or digest Torah. But what is Torah? Okay, so if a person does not have Torah, is it still possible to have faith? It is possible. So therefore, I cannot define Torah just simply as faith, because there are people with faith who don't have Torah. So what is Torah?
What Hashem said.
Oh, Torah is Hashem's wisdom. Torah is Hashem's wisdom. Now, at this point you might say, so, isn't that what you just said? Didn't you just say that Torah is not intellectual, and now you're saying that Torah is Hashem's wisdom? Is that not a contradiction? So let's understand. Let's understand human intellect first, because we do know, for example, and we're going to read it on Wednesday, in the Haftarah of the fast day. Hashem says, Kiloi machshavoisai, machshavoiseichem, which most people understand to mean our thoughts and Hashem's thoughts are completely different. So for example, I think, why does Hashem do this to this person? And Hashem says, because I think differently to you. It's much more than that. We're not simply saying that Hashem has other ideas or sees the bigger picture that we don't necessarily see. Hashem's intellectual process, machshavoisai, is not machshavoiseichem, is not like our intellectual process. Or like the other pasuk says, Ein cheker litfunosoi. There is no comprehension of Hashem's understanding. Why not? Let's understand this. What is intellect? How does intellect work? How does intellect work? Well, let's make the question simpler. How do we as people learn? How do you learn?
It can only be within our own reasoning, within what we can understand.
So the whole way that we learn is by making things understandable to us. So, have you ever had this experience where a person starts talking about a particular idea and you have no idea what they're talking about? You sit there and think, what is this? Did I waste my time? Why did I come here? What's this person talking about? Why would that happen? Why would it happen that somebody's explaining something and we have no idea what they're talking about? Why?
They're not clear in the
They're not clear, right? And how do you become clear?
understanding.
No, I'm saying that's how you reach a point of your own clarity. How do you share clarity with somebody else? Break it down. Break it down. In other words, the whole process of intellect is to take abstract concepts and break them down into understandable concepts. I'm going to use different words for this, which will immediately make it clear to us why Torah is not simple intellect. Intellect is to take the undefined, because if I don't know it, it's not yet defined, I don't know what it is, and to define it. The better somebody can define something, the more clearly I'll understand it. That's why we use metaphors. That's why we tell stories. Because these things help us to define a concept. Now listen to that word, define. What does define mean? Make finite. That's what define is. Because previously it was like infinite to me, and I didn't know where it started and ended. And now that you've defined it, you've given it clear parameters. And the minute you give something clear parameters, then I can understand it. And that's great, and I really appreciate it because I can understand it. Now, if Torah is Hashem's wisdom, it is infinite. If it's infinite, I can never truly define that information. That doesn't mean I can never understand Torah. I just have to be honest enough to acknowledge that whatever I'm going to understand will only be skimming the surface because the real Torah cannot be defined. That makes sense? In other words, what satisfies us intellectually? What satisfies us is if somebody can explain something in terms that we can understand and appreciate. That satisfies us. So that's why you tell a teacher, know your audience. So if you're going to speak in front of a South African crowd, you could use metaphors like load shedding, potholes. You know, you could speak about having a braai. But if you go speak to an American audience and you use load shedding, they have no idea what you're talking about. So there you're going to talk about the Super Bowl, and you're going to talk about inept, whatever. Okay, we'll leave that. Right? So you're always going to use expressions that are relative to the people so that they can define things in their terms. In other words, all intellect is to bring it home, to bring the information to me. That's why they made the whole Dummies series of books. Because that's what people want. Bring it to me. That's why we prefer when people can explain it, okay, just tell me the bottom line. Or as they say in the less respectful way, I don't know if you've ever heard this, when a rabbi speaks for a while and then somebody says, Rabbi, land the plane. You ever heard that expression? Land the plane. Because that's what we want, right? We want just tachlis. Bring it home for me. And that's how we do all of our learning, and that's why we love online learning. It's at my leisure, when it suits me, at the speed that I would like to listen to. Nothing better that was ever created than double speed for recordings. It is the best, right? It's the best thing ever. So you could sit there, a person could really sit there in the comfort of their own bed on YouTube, downloading information, and there's nothing wrong with that. But is it appropriate for a person to sit in their pajamas downloading a shiur? You have to go out of yourself to get to Torah, because Torah is beyond definition. That means to say that fundamentally it is beyond us. It is beyond our space, beyond our comfort zone. So as long as we try to get Torah to fit into our space, we won't be getting Torah. We'll be getting information, but we won't be getting Torah. We'll have the intellectual component, but we won't get the divine component. So Heve Goylel im Koim Torah is a fundamental principle of Judaism. Not only at the stage where a person should be studying in a yeshiva, they have to get on a plane and they have to go somewhere else in order to learn. It's every single day. When we decide that we're going to learn Torah, it has to be Goylel. There has to be some element of getting out of my comfort zone, or as the Midrash Shmuel says it. You know what goyle is? Goyle is a person who's just killed somebody, God forbid, inadvertently, and they have to be goyle, they have to exile themselves to an Ir Mikra, to a city of refuge. So let's just try and get into the scenario. Just picture it in your mind. Somebody's just committed this what they call culpable homicide, right? So what are they going to do? Go home, pack some bags, organize themselves. I've got to get to the Ir Miklat. No, you run for your life. Because you know that the Torah gives rights to the family to avenge the blood of their relative who was killed. So now, this person's running for their lives. Have a goylel im koim Torah. The attitude that we're supposed to take is Torah is not a convenience thing. Oh, listen, if I have some time in my calendar, maybe, I'll download that podcast and listen to it in the car while I'm also doing a few other things. That's not Torah. That's great for every other kind of intellectual process that exists out there. Torah is a journey beyond self. So if the direction is to bring it to myself, I'm walking away from what Torah is supposed to achieve. I might be very smart and I might be getting a lot of information, but Torah is not intellect. Torah is relationship with God. Fascinating, right? That's true.
Each person is their own entity. So no one person will have the same experience that they have towards Torah.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. To believe that Torah is homogeneous, correct. It cannot be an objective measure for all people. So that's exactly true. Everybody will have their circumstances, their starting point, their natural inclination of how their brain is wired, whether they're naturally a bookworm, whether they're not. All of those factors will be relevant to what constitutes Torah learning for that individual. And it's very important for us not to try and class everybody in the same class, because it doesn't work that way. So to go out of self in order to learn Torah is extremely personal. It's very important to remember that. Okay, so now I always say that there's certain triggers, right? There's certain, in today's world, if you don't have something that triggers you, then you probably are not, you've got to have triggering things in your life. So Talmud Chacham for me is a trigger. Why? Because it's true what you're saying. There are certain kind of plateau. I don't like the word plateau because it sounds like you don't have to go any further. But there are certain definitions that it seems like that person has actually hit the mark. Now let's talk about this concept of Talmud Chacham for a second. It's completely outside of this particular Mishnah, but it tells a story that is relevant to this Mishnah. How do we translate Talmud Chacham? I'm not asking what is a Talmud Chacham. So everybody tell you, Talmud Chacham, absolute Torah scholar. Great. How do you translate Talmud Chacham? Clever student. Is that how you translate it? Talmud is a student. Chacham, clever, right? Talmud Chacham. Now we're talking, right? Okay, so I can easily say Talmud Chacham means that it's a Talmud who is a Chacham, right? But Talmud Chacham, now we're going to dig a little deeper, is Talmud is somebody who's a student of Chacham. Now you've got to ask yourself, what is Chacham? wisdom. Chokhmah is wisdom. And Chacham is the person who has mastered wisdom. And neither of those is a helpful term. Because when we say wisdom, the truth is we don't have a working definition for wisdom. We don't. I'll give you an example. Your car starts to make a funny noise, or one of those lights comes on your dashboard, and you have absolutely no idea what it means. So what do? You drive your car over to the mechanic. And the mechanic opens up the hood of the car, looks inside, knows exactly what's wrong, fixes it. What do you say? Brilliant. This mechanic is brilliant. So smart. Now, is that wisdom? All you're really saying, if we're honest, is we're saying, you know something I don't know. And that, in a sense, encapsulates the problem with the term wisdom. We usually consider people to have wisdom or to be wise if they know things we don't know. Right? Okay, so, but I'm saying, when we say chokhmah, what do we typically mean? If we're honest with ourselves, we mean, wow, you are so smart because you know what I don't know. It's a very subjective definition. So let's try to understand what chokhmah is, and thereby what a Talmid Chacham is, and thereby what this Mishnah is telling us. So you could say chokhmah is wisdom, yes, absolutely. But we also speak about the three different intellectual processes, chokhmah, bina, and da'as, the three different intellectual processes. And just to focus now on what chokhmah is for a second, and then we'll bring it back to this Mishnah. And by the way, why it is related to a rabbi called Rabbi Nehorai. What's Nehorai? Light. What's light and intellect? Where would light be a metaphor in intellect? Torah. That's kind of predictable, right? I'm saying a little bit more specifically. Enlightenment, which means when you can see, then it is clear. When something is light, then it is clear. When something is dark or murky, then it's unclear. Okay. So Rabbi Nehorai is a rabbi who, the Gemara tells us, he was Meir Einei Chachamim. He illuminated the eyes of the sages. What does that mean? How do you illuminate? So, let's use a quick example. Right now, if you look at this board, are you unsure of what it is? Does anybody have any doubt as to what this is? No. Okay, you know what it is. You can see it. Because when you can see something, that's when it's light and that's when it's clear. Now, what if we were playing one of those games? You know those board games where you're not allowed to use certain words to describe something and then the person has to guess what it is? Okay? So now, let's say we're playing that game and you've been given whiteboard. And now you've got to describe to your partner in the game whiteboard without using words like white, board, screen. Okay? So what happens now? Why has it become a game? Because now it's unclear. And all you're working with is you have to listen to what the other person's telling you to try to work this out. Okay? What's the difference between light and dark? It's the difference between what you see and what you hear. What you see is light. It's absolutely clear. What you hear, not so much. Maybe you didn't hear them right. You ever had that? Somebody told me. Yeah, maybe you heard wrong. That's the distinction between chokhmah and bina. Chokhmah is when you have such clarity about a concept, you have such clarity that it is now indisputable. Bina is when you're researching a concept, and through the course of your research, you never know if you've reached the full extent of what the subject is all about. So you keep researching, and you keep learning more. Talmid Chacham is what? A Talmid Chacham is somebody who is constant, because Talmid is a title. You only get a title if you're constantly that way. So for example, a doctor is not only a doctor on Wednesdays. If you're a doctor, that means you're always a doctor. Even if you're not on call. Even if you're at a simcha. And people come over and they say, sorry, I really don't want to disturb you after hours, but... Okay, because you're a doctor. It doesn't matter where you are, when it is, you're a doctor. So if you're a Talmid, you're not only a Talmid when you're sitting in the classroom. If you're a Talmid, that's who you are. What's a Talmid Chacham? A Talmid Chacham is somebody who is constantly in the pursuit of Chachma, of absolute clarity in issues of Torah. So, the Talmid Chacham has to move goyle as much as we do. Because goyle means going outside of your existing comfort zone. And because Torah is infinite, you never reach a point where you say, oh, I don't have to do this anymore. I don't have to push myself anymore. You have to push yourself just as much as a Talmid Chacham as a person has to push themselves when they just start learning. So that's really important information. And that's why he's quoting what Shlomo HaMelech has already told us. Because Shlomo HaMelech, if you read the context over there in Mishlei, Shlomo HaMelech there is talking about somebody who's just begun their process of learning. You've just begun. Don't rely on your own understanding. Rabbi Nohiroi is writing in Pirkei Avos. And we've seen already that Pirkei Avos is not the letter of the law. It is conduct. An ideal conduct. Ideal conduct in Judaism is even if you're now a Torah scholar, you still have to be goylel in Koim Torah. You still have to el binoschal tisha'in. Don't rely on your own understanding, because it never stops. As soon as we appreciate and understand that the goal of Judaism is to reach out towards Hashem, towards Torah, which is an infinite goal, that's when you realize you can never be satisfied where you are, and you can never expect that it's going to come your way.
Rabbi, so going back a bit, what does it mean? You say in the big time Shema that Hashem illuminates your eyes.
Right.
What does it mean?
So we don't say that Hashem illuminates our eyes, we ask Hashem to illuminate our eyes. Right? We ask Hashem to illuminate our eyes, which means that all we can do in life is we can put in effort, but we can't guarantee the results of that effort. So we ask Hashem, we'll put in the effort to learn as much as we can, and you bless our efforts that we actually get that clarity. So it's a humbling moment, right? Where, as there are many through the course of davening, there are quite a number of humbling moments. We recognize that we're actually saying to Hashem, you have to help us to get over the finish line. So that's a great example of that. Okay, so what's it got to do with Purim?
Nothing's clear.
What's it got to do with Purim? So in the time we have, I'm going to try to condense a very beautiful concept about Purim into just a few moments. How do you celebrate Purim? Now I know what you're going to say, right? I know what you're going to say. You're going to give me a list. If I ask you how to celebrate Purim, you'll respond with a list. And we could do that for any yontiv. How do you celebrate? Okay, let's not say the Pesach words. Too close for comfort. Okay. Any yontiv, you'll come back with a list. How do you celebrate it? You've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do it, whatever. That tells me how you fulfill the halachic requirements of that particular day. How do you celebrate should be the theme. And as a result of that, the thematic emotional space you're in on that particular day. So Pesach would be the sense of freedom, of liberation. Rosh Hashanah would be the sense of commitment to Hashem. Yom Kippur would be Teshuvah. So what is the sentiment with which we celebrate Purim? Simcha. Except that we have Simcha on every single Yom Tov. Mo'adim lesimcha, right? That's the greeting that they use in the Sephardi world. That's how we say it in our Kiddush and in our davening. Mo'adim lesimcha, chagim muzmanim lesosan. Every Yom Tov is Simcha. So what's unique about Purim?
Maybe wonder.
What do you mean by wonder? Gratitude is in every Yom Tov. That's why we have Hallel. The Megillah on Purim replaces Hallel, because that's gratitude. That's not the uniqueness of Purim. What's that? Okay, so what do we do on Purim that exhibits enlightenment? Hanukkah, we light candles. There you could see a theme. Now, do you notice that everybody, consciously or subconsciously, right now, is avoiding the one thing nobody wants to say? Exactly. Ad de lo yada. What is Purim? Purim, you got to lose your mind. You got to lose your mind on Purim. Okay? Now, this is a very touchy, controversial part of Judaism, and every single year, at this time of the year, somewhere, somebody is going to give a shiur or have a podcast about not getting drunk. Ad lo yada. So I want to ask you a question. Does the Torah want us to get drunk?
No.
Let's put it in context. Let's put it in context. I think everybody will agree that the Rambam is a pretty reliable halachic authority, yes? The Rambam writes that when it comes to every other Yom Tov, where there is a chiyuv, an obligation, not just to celebrate and not just to have a meal, but to have wine, because in simcha ela beyayin, as the Gemara tells us, wine is a key component of simcha. The Rambam writes two things. Number one, if a person gets drunk on Yom Tov, harei zoi hoilulus. It's a very frivolous, meaningless pursuit. Number two, therefore on Yom Tov, they used to send out authorities to go house to house to make sure that people behaved appropriately on Yom Tov. The same Rambam tells us. The same Rambam. What do you have to do? Keitzad mitzvah seuda zoi. What is the definition of the mitzvah of the Purim seuda? To eat and then to drink until you pass out from being drunk. And we're all like, really? So let's understand. I'm going to ask a question that I don't anticipate anybody knows the answer to, for one simple reason, because even though it's glaring in the Megillah, nobody talks about it enough. What did the Jews do right on Purim? We know what Hashem did right. He saved us from Haman. What did we do right that earned us that miracle?
Connected with Hashem.
Connected with Hashem, more specifically.
Accepted the Torah.
Oh, at the end of the Megillah it tells us, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim aleihem ve'al zaram, that the Jews committed themselves to, and they accepted for them and for their descendants to be committed to Torah. Ask the Gemara, Kimu v'kiblu, it's the wrong way around. It should say Kiblu, they accepted v'kimu, and then they did what they upheld what they accepted. Says the Gemara, Kimu ma shekiblu kvar, that at the time of Purim, they committed what they had already accepted at Sinai. Except at Sinai, the Gemara tells us, Hashem suspended the mountain over their heads and said, right, let's make a deal. Would you like the Torah, or would you like this tombstone? Pick your choice. Says the Gemara, Mikan moida'a rabba lo'iraisa. Because of that, there was a huge excuse that any person could have ever used if they didn't fulfill Torah mitzvahs properly, because they could say, I didn't really want to do it, I was forced. That means that for about 1,000 years, almost, from when the Torah was given until the story of Purim, we all had an out. We all had an out because we could say we didn't want to necessarily do the Torah, but Hashem threatened us. We didn't have a choice. At the time of Purim, that flipped. Because at the time of Purim, it was the exact opposite. Not were we being forced to keep Torah, we were being forced to give up Torah. Because if you would turn your back on Torah, Haman would spare you. And yet for almost a year, the Jews were prepared to do everything. They went to shul, they participated, they showed their commitment to Torah to the extent of Mesiras Nefesh, literally putting their lives on the line. So now, what's the link between Mesiras Nefesh and Torah? Nobody thinks about this, right? Why? Why don't we think about this? Because we think that Torah is intellectual. And so we think that Torah is all about understanding, learning. Why is it that Kimu Masha Kiblu, that the moment in Jewish history where they accepted the Torah with greater commitment than even at Sinai itself was when, not when they sat and learned 24/7, but when they were willing to put their lives on the line. Why? Because Because if you want to go to the Torah, you have to be willing to step out of your world and go into a state of Golus. Did you know that in Gemara we say that Golus is akin to death? That's why it atones for a person. The theme of Purim is, if you want to connect with Hashem each year on Purim, like the Jews did then, Ad lo yoda. You have to recognize that your commitment to Judaism and to God and to Torah is lo yoda. It's not about what makes sense to you. It's not about what you understand. It's not about getting Torah in your space on your terms. The whole purpose of Purim is have a goylenim kon Torah. You have to get out of yourself to a place of Torah. So now, the average person, I'm sorry to say, who's going to overindulge on alcohol is not going to get to a place of goylenim kon Torah. It's not going to happen. In which case, they should not be drinking. But what is the goal? The goal is Adelo Yoda, that somehow through the course of Purim, and each person has to work out how exactly you do this, but somehow through the course of Purim, Purim should be where we confront within ourselves our capacity to be dedicated to Hashem and His Torah in a way that's lo yoda, that's not based on my understanding or my appreciation or my comfort zone or my needs. Maybe a l'chaim or two opens a person up, maybe. And if not, what do? How do you shortcut the system? So the Rambam tells you. The Rambam says more than you spend on your Seudah, and more than you spend on your Mishloach Monos, you should spend on Matanos Le'evyoinim, on giving gifts to destitute people. And without getting overly technical, the Rambam says because you have an obligation to create simcha for them on Purim. Simcha for me, that's expecting the Torah to come to me. Simcha for somebody else who is not naturally in a state of simcha. And I can make them have simcha, that's goyle. That takes me outside of myself. And that is another way that a person, I'm not saying that equals Adelo Yoda, but it's a similar theme of Adelo Yoda, that my Judaism should not be about what's comfortable for me, easy for me, or makes sense to me. It should be all about pushing myself beyond myself to connect to Hashem. When a person is willing to go into some element of Golus, then they get to the place of Torah. Okay, good lesson, right?